The sheriff's boots echoed on the linoleum floor as he entered the quiet laundromat. It was well past midnight, and the buzz of machines filled the air, masking the eerie stillness of the small town at night. That's when he saw her, a little girl sitting alone on a plastic chair near a spinning dryer. Her tiny frame was wrapped in an oversized coat, and her scuffed sneakers dangled off the edge of the seat. She hugged the threadbare teddy bear as if it was her only friend in the world. Sheriff Daniels froze. Where were her parents? He'd been driving by for weeks, noticing the same scene. A gnawing worry began to churn in his chest, but tonight, something was different. Her eyes met his. Wide and full of something he couldn't quite name, fear, maybe, or something deeper. He tipped his hat. "Hey there, sweetheart. You waiting for someone?" The girl didn't answer. She just clutched her teddy bear tighter. Before we dive into this story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. Sheriff Daniels knelt to her level, his voice softening. "It's late. Shouldn't you be home by now?" The girl glanced at the dryer, which whirred as it tumbled a small pile of clothes. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I have to wait for the clothes." He frowned. Her words raised more questions than answers. "Where are your parents?" He pressed gently. Her lips trembled, and she looked down at her teddy bear. "They're busy," she said, avoiding his gaze. A chill ran down the sheriff's spine. This wasn't right. He stood up, scanning the room for any sign of an adult. Nothing. Just the hum of machines and the rhythmic thud of the dryer. He decided then and there, he'd come back every night until he got to the bottom of this. Something about that little girl's lonely eyes wouldn't let him walk away. The next night, Sheriff Daniels parked his cruiser outside the laundromat. The neon open 24 hours sign flickered against the dark sky, casting faint shadows on the empty street. He leaned back in his seat, sipping his coffee, his eyes glued to the door. At exactly 10:45 p.m., she appeared again. The same coat, the same teddy bear. She slipped inside silently, her small figure swallowed by the fluorescent glow of the laundromat. Sheriff Daniels felt a pang of sadness as he watched her shuffle to the same chair, placing a plastic bag of clothes in the nearest washer. Who was she? And why was she always alone? Tonight, he decided to stay hidden, observing from the shadows. If no one showed up to claim her, he'd step in again. Hours passed, and the laundromat remained empty except for the girl. Sheriff Daniels noticed she moved with practiced precision, loading the washer, pouring detergent, waiting patiently as if she'd done this 100 times before. But something about the way she kept glancing at the door unsettled him. Was she waiting for someone? Or hiding from someone? Suddenly, a sound cut through the night, a car engine rumbling down the street. The sheriff's hand instinctively moved to his holster. A beat-up sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights dim. A man stepped out, his silhouette tall and thin. He walked past the laundromat's glass door without looking inside. The little girl froze, her body stiffening. Sheriff Daniels watched as she shrank into her chair, clutching her teddy bear like a shield. The man didn't stop, disappearing into the darkness, but the sheriff's gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. On the third night, Sheriff Daniels made his move. This time, he entered the laundromat quietly, careful not to startle her. The girl was folding clothes from a basket, her small hands smoothing out every wrinkle with care. When she noticed him, her eyes widened, but she didn't run. "I saw you again tonight," he said gently. "Are you here every night, sweetheart?" She nodded but didn't speak. He crouched next to her, trying to meet her eye level. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Lila." "Lila," he repeated with a warm smile. "That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me why you're always here alone? Are you waiting for someone?" Her hands gripped the edge of the basket, knuckles white. I can't leave. I have to do the laundry." Her voice wavered, and her eyes darted to the door. The sheriff's heart broke a little more. Something wasn't adding up, and he vowed to find out why this little girl was carrying a burden far too heavy for her tiny shoulders. Sheriff Daniels sat down across from Lila, careful not to crowd her. He kept his voice calm and steady. Lila, I'm here to help you. If something's wrong, you can tell me. For a moment, it looked like she might speak, but then she quickly shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. I promised I wouldn't tell, she whispered so softly he almost didn't hear. Promised who? He pressed gently, his heart aching at her fear. But she clamped her mouth shut and turned back to folding the small pile of clothes. Sheriff Daniels leaned back, a knot forming in his stomach. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than a child doing laundry late at night. He decided to take a different approach. Lila, do you live close by? Can I walk you home? She froze, her hands tightening on the fabric. No, she said firmly. I can't go home until it's done. After Lila finished folding the last of her clothes, she packed them carefully into a plastic bag. Without a word, she slipped out the door and disappeared into the night. Sheriff Daniels watched her go, torn between following her and respecting her space, as he walked back to his cruiser. He made up his mind, he couldn't let this go. He needed answers. He reached out to dispatch. This is Daniels. Can you run a check for any recent reports of missing children in the area? The radio crackled, and the operator responded. No reports in the past month, Sheriff. Do you need us to follow up on something? Daniels hesitated. Not yet. But keep your ears open. He hung up, staring into the darkness where Lila had disappeared. Who was she protecting? And what was she afraid of? The next night, Sheriff Daniels parked a block away, determined to follow Lila when she left the laundromat. He'd brought a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars, settling in for a long night. At the usual time, Lila appeared, her small figure illuminated by the laundromat's harsh lights. She carried the same plastic bag, moving with the same quiet determination. But tonight, Daniels noticed something new, a shadow across her face that wasn't just exhaustion. It was fear. Hours later, as she stepped out into the cold, he slipped out of his cruiser, keeping a safe distance. She turned down an alley, her footsteps quick and nervous. Daniels followed, his heart pounding. The alley was dark and narrow, and when she stopped suddenly, he ducked behind a dumpster, holding his breath. Lila turned and looked around, clutching her bag tightly. Then, to his shock, she whispered into the darkness. I did it. Please don't be mad. Sheriff Daniels crept closer, straining to hear. A low, gravelly voice answered from the darkness. Took you long enough. Give it here. Daniels felt a surge of anger. Someone was making this little girl do their dirty work. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice firm and commanding. That's enough. Step away from her. Lila gasped, spinning around to face him, her eyes wide with panic. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man with hollow cheeks and a menacing glare. He looked between Daniels and Lila, then bolted down the alley. Stay here. Daniels barked, but Lila grabbed his arm, shaking her head. No. Don't chase him. She cried. Tears streamed down her face. Please, don't make it worse. Daniels froze, torn between following the man and comforting the terrified girl. He chose her, kneeling to her level. Lila, who was that? What's going on? She sobbed into her teddy bear, her small frame trembling. I can't tell you, she whispered. He'll hurt us. Sheriff Daniels gently placed his hands on Lila's trembling shoulders, speaking softly but firmly. Lila, no one's going to hurt you. I won't let them. But I can't help you if I don't know what's going on. Please, trust me. Her tear-streaked face tilted up to meet his eyes, searching for sincerity. You don't understand, she said, her voice cracking. It's not just me. It's my brother. If I tell, he'll hurt him. Daniel's heart sank. The man in the shadows wasn't just using Lila, he had leverage, and now the stakes were even higher. He fought to keep his expression calm as he said, Lila, where is your brother? Is he safe? She hesitated, then shook her head, clinging tightly to her teddy bear. He's hiding. I don't know where. He said he'd find me when it's safe. Sheriff Daniels guided Lila back to his cruiser, wrapping his jacket around her small shoulders. Let's get you somewhere warm, he said, opening the door. As he settled her into the passenger seat, his eyes caught the bag she carried everywhere. What's in the bag, Lila? He asked gently. Her eyes darted to the bag, and she clutched it protectively. Just clothes, she said quickly. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He reached for the bag slowly, giving her time to stop him. When she didn't, he opened it carefully. Inside, along with the neatly folded clothes, was a small notebook. Can I look at this? He asked, holding it up. Lila hesitated but nodded reluctantly. Daniels flipped it open, scanning the pages. His stomach turned as he saw pages filled with hastily scribbled names, addresses, and dollar amounts. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a ledger. The names in the ledger weren't random. Sheriff Daniels recognized some of them: local shop owners, a teacher from the middle school, even the mayor's assistant. The dollar amounts varied, but the implication was clear: someone was extorting these people, and Lila was caught in the middle. Lila, he said carefully, closing the notebook, who gave you this? Was it the man in the alley? She nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. He said if I didn't bring it back every week, something bad would happen to my brother. Daniels clenched his fists, anger bubbling under his calm demeanor. Whoever was behind this was using children to do their dirty work, and they didn't care about the consequences. He looked at Lila, his voice firm but kind. This ends tonight, Lila. I promise you, no one's going to hurt you or your brother. But I need your help. Can you tell me where to find him? Lila shook her head quickly. I don't know. He never told me. He said it was safer if I didn't know. Daniels leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Do you remember anything he said? Maybe where he might go if he was in trouble. She bit her lip, thinking hard. He likes the old train yard, she said hesitantly. He used to take me there when we were little. It was our secret place. Daniels nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He turned the key in the ignition, glancing at Lila. We'll check it out. But first, I'm taking you somewhere safe. As the cruiser pulled away, Lila leaned against the window, clutching her teddy bear tightly. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Sheriff Daniels drove in silence, the hum of the car filling the space between them. Lila's eyes drooped, exhaustion catching up to her. He glanced at her small frame bundled in his jacket and made a decision. He pulled up to a cozy yellow house with a porch light glowing warmly. This was the home of Mrs. Clara Winslow, a retired schoolteacher who had a heart for children in need. Daniels knocked softly, and Clara opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of him. Sheriff? What's going on? She asked, her kind eyes settling on Lila. Clara, this is Lila, he said gently. She needs a safe place to stay tonight. Can you help? Clara knelt, smiling warmly. Of course, I can. Come on in, sweetheart. Let's get you some hot chocolate. Lila hesitated, looking up at Daniels. You'll come back, right? I promise, he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're safe here. The old train yard was dark and eerie, the moonlight casting long shadows across the rusted tracks and abandoned cars. Sheriff Daniels parked at the edge, stepping out into the crisp night air. He moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Each creak of metal and crunch of gravel underfoot sent his nerves on edge. Hello. He called out, his voice echoing through the emptiness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then he heard it, a faint rustling from one of the train cars. He moved toward the sound, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. It's Sheriff Daniels. I'm here to help, he said firmly. The door to the train car slid open just enough for a pair of wide, frightened eyes to peer out. A boy, no older than 12, stepped into the light, clutching a rusted pipe in trembling hands. Are you Lila's brother? Daniels asked, keeping his voice calm. The boy nodded slowly. Did she send you? Daniels lowered himself to the boy's eye level, keeping his flashlight pointed away to avoid startling him. She didn't send me, but she told me about you. My name's Sheriff Daniels. I want to help you both. The boy's shoulders sagged, and he dropped the pipe, tears spilling down his dirty cheeks. I didn't know what else to do, he whispered. They said they'd hurt her if I didn't stay hidden. Daniels placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. You don't have to do this alone anymore. I've got Lila somewhere safe. Let's get you out of here too. The boy hesitated, looking back at the train car. What about the ledger? Did they take it? Daniels shook his head. No, I have it. We're going to stop them, but I need your help. Can you tell me who they are? The boy's face darkened. It's not just one person. It's a group. They're everywhere. The boy sat in the front seat of Daniel's cruiser, his small hands trembling in his lap. Daniels handed him a bottle of water. Take your time, he said gently. Start from the beginning. Who's behind this? The boy glanced out the window, as if the shadows themselves were listening. They call themselves the Circle, he said in a low voice. They're everywhere, people you wouldn't expect. The man who made us do things. He works for them. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard whispers about organized crime in the town, but nothing concrete. Now, it wasn't just a rumor. What kind of things did they make you do? He asked cautiously. The boy looked down, his voice barely audible. Deliver money. Pick up packages. They said if we didn't, they'd hurt her. His voice cracked, and tears welled in his eyes. Sheriff Daniels pulled over into a quiet parking lot, switching off the engine. He turned to the boy, his expression firm but kind. Listen, what they've done to you and Lila is wrong. We're going to stop them, but I can't do it without your help. Will you work with me? The boy hesitated, then nodded. Okay. But you have to promise. You'll keep her safe. Daniels placed a hand on his shoulder. You have my word. As they drove back to Clara's house, Daniel's mind raced. He needed more evidence before he could take on a network like this. But he also knew time was running out. If the group realized Lila and her brother were no longer under their control, they might retaliate. Arriving at Clara's house, Daniels parked the cruiser and looked at the boy. For now, you'll stay here with your sister. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next steps. Inside Clara's warm home, Lila's face lit up when she saw her brother. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. I was so scared. She cried, I'm here now. He said, his voice shaky but comforting. Clara watched them with a soft smile, then turned to Daniels. I'll keep an eye on them tonight. You go home and rest. Daniels nodded, though rest was the last thing on his mind. As he drove back to the station, his thoughts churned. How deep did the circle run? Who could he trust? When he reached his desk, he opened the ledger again, studying the names. He needed to find a pattern, a thread to pull. But as he stared at the pages, one name jumped out at him, a name he never expected to see. It was someone from his own department. The name on the page was Lieutenant Greg Harlow, a senior officer who had been with the force for over 2 decades. Daniels leaned back in his chair, disbelief washing over him. Harlow was well respected, known for his dedication to the job, but now, Daniels couldn't ignore the connection. The amounts listed next to Harlow's name were significant, suggesting he wasn't just a participant, he might be a key player. Daniels' hand hovered over the phone, tempted to confront him immediately. But he stopped himself. If Harlow truly was involved, tipping him off could put Lila and her brother in even greater danger. Instead, Daniels made a decision. He would gather evidence quietly, ensuring there was no way for Harlow, or anyone else, to cover their tracks. As the clock struck midnight, Daniels knew the fight had only just begun. The next morning, Daniels called in a favor from an old friend, Detective Rachel Monroe, who worked in a neighboring county. Rachel was known for her sharp instincts and unwavering integrity. He trusted her with his life, meeting her at a diner on the outskirts of town, Daniels slid the ledger across the table. "Take a look," he said, his voice low. "I need your eyes on this." Rachel flipped through the pages, her expression growing more serious with every turn. "Daniels, this isn't just small-time crime. This is organized, and it's big. Are you sure about these names?" Daniels nodded grimly. "One of them is Harlow. I can't believe it, but I can't ignore it either. I need to know how deep this goes, and I need your help." Rachel leaned back, tapping her fingers on the table. "You're asking me to walk into a hornet's nest. But for you? I'm in. Let's bring them down." While Rachel began her analysis of the ledger, Daniels returned to Clara's house to check on Lila and her brother, who finally introduced himself as Ethan. The boy seemed more at ease, but there was a haunted look in his eyes that didn't fade. "Sheriff," Ethan said as Daniels sat beside him on the porch. "I've been thinking. There's someone who might know more about the circle. An old man named Henry. He used to work with them, but they cast him out." "Why did they turn on him?" Daniels asked. Ethan shrugged. "He said something about them going too far. He didn't want to be part of it anymore." Daniels nodded. "Where can I find him?" Ethan hesitated. "He lives near the edge of the woods, in a cabin. But he's strange. People say he doesn't trust anyone." Daniels stood, determination hardening his features. "Then I'll just have to earn his trust." The drive to the woods was long and winding, the road narrowing as Daniels approached the cabin Ethan had described. The structure was small and weathered, its windows boarded up. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Daniels knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a long pause, the door creaked open just enough for an old man's face to appear. His eyes were sharp, darting suspiciously. "Who are you, and what do you want?" The man growled. "My name's Sheriff Daniels," he said calmly. "I'm looking into a group called the Circle. I heard you might know something about them." The man's face darkened, and he started to close the door. Daniels quickly added, "I'm trying to protect two kids they've been using. A boy named Ethan and his sister, Lila." The door stopped. Henry's eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained gruff. "Ethan. That boy doesn't deserve what they've done. Come in. But I can't promise you'll like what you hear." Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and old books. Henry motioned for Daniels to sit at a cluttered table, then poured them each a cup of bitter coffee. "The Circle isn't just a group of criminals," Henry began, his voice low and steady. "They've got influence, money, power, and connections in places you wouldn't believe. They don't just control people, they own them." Daniels leaned forward. "Why did you leave them?" Henry's eyes flickered with pain. "Because they stopped caring about limits. They started using kids, orphans, runaways. People who wouldn't be missed. That's when I said enough. But you don't walk away from the Circle without consequences." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of consequences?" Henry sighed. "They'll come for anyone who stands in their way. If you're not careful, Sheriff, you'll paint a target on those kids, and yourself." Henry reached into a wooden chest near the fireplace, pulling out an old, leather-bound journal. He slid it across the table to Daniels. "This is everything I know," he said. "Names, places, deals I was part of before I got out." Daniels flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the names. Some were familiar, local business owners, politicians, but others were shocking. People with spotless reputations were listed alongside transaction details and coded messages. Henry pointed to one entry. "That's where the kids come in. They've been using them for smuggling small items, cash, drugs, even information. Kids draw less suspicion." Daniels clenched his fists. "Why hasn't anyone stopped them?" Henry chuckled bitterly. "Because anyone who tries either ends up dead or scared silent. They have judges, cops, and even media in their pocket. You go after the Circle, Sheriff, you'd better be ready to lose everything." Daniel stood, determination burning in his chest. If it means saving those kids and stopping this, then so be it. Back at Clara's house, Daniels gathered Rachel, Clara, and Henry for an emergency meeting. The kitchen table became a makeshift war room as Henry laid out maps and notes from his journal. Rachel traced a finger over a warehouse marked in red. This seems like their main hub. It's where most of the transactions take place. If we can catch them in the act, we'll have evidence to bring them down. Henry shook his head. It's not that simple. The warehouse is heavily guarded, and they rotate schedules. If you're off by even a minute, you'll walk into a trap. Daniels looked at Ethan, who sat quietly in the corner. Do you know anything about the schedules or security? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. I used to deliver there. They always brought in the biggest shipments on Friday nights. Rachel tapped the table. That's 2 days from now. If we move quickly, we can set up surveillance and gather intel. Daniels looked at the group, his voice firm. We do this carefully. No one moves until we're sure those kids and everyone else involved are safe. As the group began planning, an ominous knock echoed at the front door. Daniels motioned for everyone to stay quiet as he approached the door, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Sheriff Daniels, a deep voice called from outside. Open up. We just want to talk. Daniels peered through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits standing on the porch. Their clean-cut appearances did little to mask the menace in their eyes. What do you want? Daniels asked, not opening the door. One of the men smiled coldly. We heard you've been asking questions. That's not a good idea, Sheriff. The circle doesn't take kindly to meddling. Daniels felt a surge of anger but kept his voice steady. You can tell your boss that I'm not backing down. The man's smile faded. Your funeral, he said before turning to leave. Inside, Henry shook his head. They know you're onto them now. Things are going to get dangerous. Daniels nodded, his resolve hardening. Let them come. We're ready. The threat at the door had shaken everyone except Daniels. He stood at the center of the kitchen, his jaw set and his eyes blazing with determination. We don't have time to second-guess, he said firmly. They know we're coming, which means they'll either tighten security or make a move to eliminate us. We have to act fast. Rachel began organizing the intel they had gathered, marking key locations on the map. We need backup, she said. Trustworthy officers only, no one with ties to the circle. Daniels nodded. I'll call in a few friends I can trust. Meanwhile, we need to ensure the kids are safe. Clara stepped forward. I'll take care of Lila and Ethan. They'll stay hidden at my sister's place out of town. No one knows about it. Henry cleared his throat. If you're going after them, you'll need more than just a plan. You'll need to be ready for anything. I'll show you how they operate, how to stay one step ahead. The group nodded in agreement. Time was running out, and they all felt the weight of what was at stake. That evening, Clara packed a small bag for Lila and Ethan. The siblings stood by the door, holding hands tightly. Lila looked up at Daniels with wide, worried eyes. Will we be okay? She asked softly. Daniels knelt down to her level, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You'll be safe, I promise. Clara is taking you somewhere no one can find you. Ethan hesitated. What if they come after us? Clara stepped in, her voice gentle but firm. They won't. I'll protect you both with everything I have. As the trio left, Daniels felt a pang of guilt. He hated separating the kids, but it was the only way to keep them out of harm's way. Rachel joined him at the window, watching the car disappear down the road. They're in good hands, she said. Daniels nodded, his gaze steely. Now it's our turn to finish this. Just as the group began finalizing their plan, Daniels' phone buzzed. The number was unknown, but he answered cautiously. Sheriff Daniels, the voice on the other end drawled. I hope you're not thinking of doing something reckless. Daniels stiffened. Who is this? You know who I am, the voice replied, cold and mocking. The circle doesn't appreciate people poking their noses where they don't belong. Consider this your last warning. The line went dead, but Daniel's gut told him the threat was more than just words. Moments later, Rachel's phone lit up with a notification. "Daniels," she said urgently, "look at this." She showed him a photo, a live feed of Clara's car parked at a gas station. The image was accompanied by a chilling message, "You can't hide them forever." Daniels clenched his fists, his heart pounding. "They're tracking them. We need to move now." Rachel grabbed her keys. "I'll head to the safe house and get them to a new location. You and Henry handle the warehouse." Daniels nodded. "Be careful, Rachel. This just got personal." Rachel drove through the winding roads with a tight grip on the steering wheel. The message from the circle was still echoing in her mind, "You can't hide them forever." It was a warning, and it hit close to home. Clara's sister lived in a remote area, but she wasn't sure how much time they had before the circle's reach closed in on them. As she approached the turnoff to the safe house, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Daniels, "Move fast. We've got a window of opportunity. Keep the kids hidden until we get there." Rachel slammed the brakes as she skidded into the gravel driveway of the safe house. She quickly grabbed her phone, sending a text to Clara's sister to let her know they had arrived. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears as she ran to the door, praying they weren't already too late. The door swung open, and Clara's sister stood there, holding Lila and Ethan tightly in her arms. "They were already asking about you," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't know how much longer we can keep them safe." Rachel's mind raced. "They're here already, but how?" "Get them in the back room," Rachel ordered. "Lock the door and don't come out until I say so." As Rachel hurried back to her car, she caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, two dark vehicles slowing down near the entrance to the safe house. Panic surged in her chest. The circle had found them. She quickly reversed and sped out of the driveway, taking a hard left down the narrow back road. The vehicles followed, their headlights cutting through the night like two predatory eyes. Rachel's breath quickened, and her knuckles turned white as she gripped the wheel, trying to shake them off. She took a sharp turn into a secluded wooded area, praying the trees would give her some cover. But as she glanced in her side mirror, she saw the headlights still closing in. "They won't stop until they have the kids," she thought grimly. Rachel had to think fast. She reached into the glove compartment and grabbed the emergency beacon she always kept for situations like this. With a press of a button, the signal would send her exact location to Daniels. It was their only hope now. Back at the sheriff's office, Daniels was putting the final touches on their plan to infiltrate the circle's warehouse. With Henry's guidance, they knew the exact time and location of the delivery. Their window was small, but it was their best shot. "We'll enter through the back entrance," Henry said, pointing to the map. "There's a small alleyway, barely visible. From there, we can get inside unnoticed." Daniels nodded. "And once we're in?" Henry grinned, a flash of cold humor in his eyes. "We grab the goods, gather the evidence, and get out. But be prepared for a fight. The circle doesn't give up their territory easily." A deep growl of frustration rumbled in Daniel's chest. "They've already taken the kids. They won't get away with this." Henry handed him a small bag of supplies, flashlights, handcuffs, and a few other tools. "You know the plan. Don't hesitate." Daniels exhaled. He knew there was no turning back now. It was time to face the circle head-on. Rachel's heart was in her throat as she glanced over at the rearview mirror. The two vehicles were still following her, their headlights slicing through the dark like predators closing in on their prey. The road ahead seemed endless, but Rachel knew she couldn't outrun them forever. She glanced at her phone, waiting for the beacon to send her location to Daniels. She had to keep the kids safe, no matter the cost. A sudden sound startled her, tires screeching as one of the cars behind her made a sharp turn onto a side road. She forced herself to stay calm, but she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. The circle was already closing in. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Daniels. The text simply read, "We're on our way to the warehouse. Get to the rendezvous point." Rachel knew that rendezvous point was her only hope. She pushed the pedal to the floor, the car roaring to life as she sped down the road toward safety. Hoping and praying she'd make it in time, Rachel's car roared down the winding road, her heart hammering in her chest. The two black SUVs were still tailing her, their headlights blinding. She could feel the cold sweat on her brow, but she couldn't afford to let panic take over. She glanced at the dashboard, her fuel was running low. Great. Just great. The trees on either side of the road blurred as she pushed the car harder, praying the engine would hold out just a little longer. Then, in the distance, she saw it, the abandoned gas station. It wasn't much, but it was a spot she knew well. If she could get there, she could hopefully lose them in the shadows. She slammed the brakes as she turned into the station. Fishtailing slightly. The black SUVs were close now, but she had one more trick to play. Without thinking, she hit the button on her rearview mirror, activating the car's emergency light system. The blinding flash of lights caught the pursuing vehicles off guard, giving Rachel just enough time to duck into a narrow alley behind the station. She parked the car in the shadows, holding her breath as the two SUVs sped past without noticing her. Her pulse raced, but she knew she couldn't relax, not yet. She grabbed her phone and shot a quick message to Daniels, "They're off me for now." Heading to the rendezvous point, she only hoped she could make it there without encountering any more trouble. Meanwhile, Daniels and Henry were closing in on the warehouse. The night was thick with tension as they crouched behind a stack of crates, observing the activity inside. Daniels' breath was shallow, his body taut with readiness. "They don't know we're here yet," Henry whispered, glancing over at Daniels. "You ready?" Daniels didn't respond right away, his eyes focused on the dimly lit entrance. His mind was racing, he could almost feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. The circle had the kids. They were out there, somewhere, and he was getting closer to the truth. He nodded firmly. "Let's do this." The two moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows as they crept closer to the warehouse door. Henry pulled out a small tool and picked the lock with practiced ease. Within seconds, the door creaked open, and they slipped inside. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of old paper and dust. They could hear murmurs coming from the far end of the warehouse. Daniels motioned for Henry to follow him, and they moved silently through the rows of stacked boxes. "Stay sharp," Daniels muttered. They rounded a corner and froze. Up ahead, a group of men were loading crates into a truck. Daniels could make out some of their faces, but there was no sign of the kids. Where were they? Rachel's car pulled up to the rendezvous point, her heart still pounding from the chase. She had made it. But she knew this was only the calm before the storm. She glanced around nervously. The area was desolate, with nothing but empty buildings and overgrown grass. But as she pulled the keys from the ignition, a sudden thought struck her. "Where's Clara?" Her phone buzzed again. It was a call from Clara's sister. "Rachel, we have a problem." Her stomach dropped. "What happened?" "They came after us," Clara's sister said, her voice shaking. "Two men in black suits. They knew everything, who we were, where we were. I had to get out of there." "The kids," Rachel's mind raced. "Are they okay?" I think so," Clara's sister stammered. "I think they're hiding, but they'll need help. You need to get back here." Rachel's pulse quickened. They were close. Too close. She didn't wait for another word. "I'm on my way." Back at the warehouse, Daniels and Henry were crouched behind some crates, listening to the murmurs of the circle's men. Daniels motioned for Henry to move, and they crept closer. The warehouse was vast, and the shadows stretched long across the concrete floor. The murmurs grew louder as they approached the main area, where the men were unloading the crates. There were boxes everywhere, some labeled with strange symbols, others with no markings at all. Daniel's pulse quickened. What were they hiding in those crates? They reached the end of the warehouse and ducked behind a large stack of boxes. From their position, they could see into the heart of the operation. Several men were unloading crates with a sense of urgency. Daniel's eyes scanned the room for any sign of the kids, and then he saw her, Lila. She was standing near the back of the room, holding Ethan's hand tightly. They were being kept in a corner, away from the action, but it was clear they were being guarded. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. They were alive, he signaled to Henry. We move now. Without a word, Daniels and Henry moved as one. They dashed from their hiding spot, using the crates for cover. Their steps were quick, silent, almost like shadows themselves. They reached the back of the warehouse, where Lila and Ethan were huddled, still unaware of their presence. Daniels whispered, his voice soft but firm, "Lila, Ethan." The kids froze, their eyes wide with shock. But before they could react, Daniels held a finger to his lips, signaling them to stay quiet. "We're here to get you out. Stay close." Ethan's voice trembled. "Are we in trouble?" Daniels gave him a reassuring smile, despite the tension in his chest. "Not anymore." Henry quickly moved to block the entrance, keeping an eye out for any approaching guards. "Hurry up," he urged. With the kids safely between them, they began making their way back to the exit. But just as they reached the doorway, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. And they froze. They had been discovered. The loud crash sent shockwaves through the group. Daniel's heart pounded as he pushed the kids toward the back exit. He could already hear the footsteps of guards approaching from behind. "We need to move now," Henry hissed, glancing over his shoulder. Daniels nodded, gripping Lila's hand tightly while keeping a protective arm around Ethan. The kids, terrified but trusting him, ran as fast as their legs could carry them. They darted through the dark corridors of the warehouse, the sound of heavy boots thundering behind them. The guards were closing in, but Daniels couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. As they reached the back door, Daniels pushed it open, leading the group out into the night air. The cold hit them all at once, but there was no time to appreciate the relief. "We're almost there," Daniels whispered, but his voice was tight with urgency. They bolted toward the street, where the getaway car was waiting. Just as they reached the car, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching filled the air. "They're right behind us," Henry shouted. Daniels shoved the kids into the car, then jumped in after them. Without a moment's hesitation, he slammed the accelerator down, sending the car speeding away from the warehouse. Behind them, the headlights of a black SUV appeared in the distance. Rachel was only a few miles away from the warehouse when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniels. "We have them. On our way to rendezvous." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But just as she was starting to feel a sense of relief, her phone rang. It was Clara's sister again. "Rachel, you need to turn around," she said urgently. "They know where you are. The circle has eyes on you." Rachel's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, they know?" "They've been tracking your every move. They've been waiting for you to make a mistake." Clara's sister's voice was filled with fear. "They're already on their way to the rendezvous point." Rachel's mind raced. "They can't catch us." "Not now." She floored the accelerator, her grip tightening on the wheel. She had to get to Daniels and the kids before the circle did. Daniels glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing as he saw the black SUV closing in. They were being followed, and it wasn't just one car, there were two now. "Hold on tight," he said to the kids, his voice steady despite the panic rising inside. The SUV behind them was gaining speed, and Daniels knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They needed a plan. "Fast, Henry, get the road spikes," Daniels barked. Henry nodded, pulling a small device from his bag and pressing a button. The spikes shot out from the back of the car, hitting the road behind them with a sharp metallic sound. For a moment, it seemed like the pursuing vehicles were going to swerve out of the way, but one of the SUVs slammed into the spikes, its tires popping with a deafening burst. The car swerved wildly, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The other SUV pulled up next to them, its headlights blinding. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. They were almost at the junction where they could make a turn that would take them off the main road. They just had to hold on a little longer. "Get ready to turn right," Daniels said, his voice calm but urgent. As they approached the junction, Daniels jerked the wheel, making a sharp right turn onto a narrow dirt road. The pursuing SUV followed, but it wasn't built for off-road driving. With every bump and twist in the road, the SUV behind them struggled to keep up. Daniels didn't let up on the accelerator. The dirt road stretched ahead, and with each passing second, the circle's grip on them loosened. Rachel's car roared into the area just as Daniel's and the kids reached the dirt road. Her headlights pierced the darkness, and for a moment, Daniel's wasn't sure if it was the circle or an ally, but then, as the car drew closer, he saw Rachel behind the wheel. "She didn't slow down, Rachel." Daniel shouted, his voice filled with relief. "Get behind us." Without missing a beat, Rachel slammed on the brakes, swinging her car into position right behind theirs. The two cars sped down the road, side by side. Rachel glanced at Daniel's, her eyes wide with urgency. "They're right behind me," she said breathlessly. "But I think I can lose them." "Do it," Daniel said, not even questioning her. "We'll cover you." Rachel sped up, her car shooting ahead of them, but just as they thought they might have a chance, the roar of engines filled the air. Two more black SUVs had appeared from the darkness, cutting off their path. Daniel's heart raced. They were surrounded. Henry's hand went to his belt, his fingers brushing against his weapon. "We don't have much time," he said grimly. "What's the plan?" Daniel's mind worked in overdrive, trying to think of something, anything to get them out of this situation. Then he remembered the old bridge ahead. If they could make it there, they could jump off the road and take a hidden path through the forest. The circle didn't know about the path. "We take the bridge," Daniel said with determination. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the car even faster. The circle followed, their headlights blinding. As they neared the bridge, Daniels could see the end of the road. They had one shot, hold on. He yelled, making the sharp turn onto the narrow bridge. The tires screeched as Daniels veered the car onto the bridge, the wooden planks creaking under the weight. The bridge was old, barely wide enough for the car to fit, and the edges seemed to drop into a dark, rushing river below. The SUV behind them wasn't far off. "Go! Go!" Henry yelled, his voice filled with urgency as he twisted in his seat, keeping an eye on the approaching danger. Daniels gritted his teeth, pushing the car faster. The old bridge rattled with every bump and turn, the sound of the wheels grinding against the wooden slats echoing in the night. The gap between them and the pursuing vehicles narrowed. Not enough time. Rachel shouted over the roar of her engine as she followed closely behind them. She was right. If the circle had any vehicles faster or more powerful, they wouldn't stand a chance. The end of the bridge loomed. They had no more time to play games. As they reached the end of the bridge, Daniels swerved the car hard, just missing the edge as he skidded onto the dirt path leading into the forest. He hoped to lose the circle in the dense trees, but the sound of tires screeching on the bridge told him they were still on their tail. "Are you all okay back there?" Daniels called out, glancing at the kids in the back seat. Lila was clutching Ethan's hand tightly, but both of them were silent, their wide eyes fixed on the bumpy path ahead. They were scared, he could see that. But they were also strong. They had to be. "I think we lost them." Rachel's voice crackled through the radio. "But we need to keep moving, fast." The dense trees and thick underbrush made it difficult to move quickly, but Daniels kept his foot on the gas, dodging trees and rocks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The car bounced and jolted, but the kids were safe, at least for now. Behind them, the sound of the circle's SUVs became muffled by the forest. It was as if the trees themselves were swallowing the noise, hiding them from their pursuers. But Daniels knew better than to trust this temporary peace. The circle wouldn't give up so easily. "They're coming," Henry said, as he peered out the back window. "They're not far behind. We need to get to the old cabin up ahead." Daniels nodded, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "We'll make it there. Just keep your eyes peeled." The narrow path was full of sharp turns and hidden rocks, but Daniels expertly guided the car through the rough terrain. His mind was racing, but he kept his focus on the road ahead. Every second counted. The cabin appeared out of the mist, just as Henry had described it, old and weathered, nestled deep in the forest. Daniels didn't hesitate. He drove straight up to the door, slamming the car into park. "Get out, now." Daniels barked, already opening the door and jumping out of the car. The kids scrambled out first, followed by Rachel and Henry. Daniels stayed behind, watching the path behind them carefully. waiting for the inevitable. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, his heart pounding in his chest. As they reached the door of the cabin, Rachel spun around, her eyes scanning the tree line. "They're coming," she said, her voice low and steady. "We don't have much time." Daniels hurried them inside. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit room. But it was their best chance to regroup, to figure out their next move. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. But it was safe, for now. The kids huddled together in one corner, trying to be brave, but their fear was clear in their eyes. Daniels could see the stress written all over their faces. He crouched down beside them. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I promise." Lila nodded but didn't speak. Ethan's lip trembled, but he held his sister's hand tightly, as though clinging to the small sliver of hope Daniels had given them. Rachel stepped up beside him, her face etched with concern. "We've bought ourselves some time, but it won't last long. We need a plan, and we need it fast." Henry came over and pulled out a map from his bag. "The Circle knows these woods. If we stay here, they'll find us. But if we go north, we'll hit a small town. We can blend in, get supplies, and figure out our next move." Daniels hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked at the kids. "What do you think?" Lila looked up at him, her eyes still wide but filled with trust. "I want to be safe." Ethan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Me too." Without another word, Daniels made the decision. "We head north. We keep moving." They gathered what little they had, checking to make sure the car was hidden well enough to keep the Circle from tracking it, but just as they were preparing to leave, a low rumble of engines reached their ears. "Close, too close, they found us." Henry shouted, his voice sharp with panic. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The Circle was closer than he had hoped. They didn't have much time. "Get to the back, now," Daniels ordered. They all rushed to the back exit, crouching low as they heard the unmistakable sound of tires grinding against the dirt road. The Circle was right outside. The low rumble of engines grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on gravel. They were surrounded. Daniels crouched near the back exit, his ears straining to track the sounds outside. Shadows danced across the cabin walls as flashlights cut through the darkness. Rachel whispered urgently, "We can't fight them, Daniels. We have to move. Now." He nodded, signaling everyone to stay silent. Lila and Ethan clutched each other tightly, their fear palpable but quiet. Henry pulled a rusted latch, revealing a narrow crawlspace under the cabin. "This way," he whispered. "It's tight, but it'll get us out." Daniels didn't hesitate. "Kids first. Stay low." Lila and Ethan slipped into the crawlspace, their small bodies moving quickly through the narrow tunnel. Rachel followed, her breath shaky as she pulled herself forward. Daniels waited until they were all inside, his hand gripping the handle of his gun, listening for any sign of the Circle breaching the cabin. "Go." Henry hissed from behind him. Daniels ducked into the crawlspace, sliding the wooden panel back into place as he went. The space was dark and cold, the damp earth pressing against his hands and knees. The sound of footsteps above them made everyone freeze. Dust rained down as heavy boots thudded across the floorboards. "Check every corner," a gruff voice commanded from above. "They're here somewhere." The group moved silently through the crawlspace, their breaths shallow. Daniels could feel his heart pounding in his ears as he led them toward the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the end of the tunnel. Every creak of the wood above made his skin crawl. "They're not in here." Another voice shouted. Daniels heard the distinct sound of a window breaking. The Circle was tearing the cabin apart, searching for them. He quickened his pace, whispering, "Keep moving. Don't stop." Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. Daniels pushed open a small, camouflaged hatch, revealing the thick forest beyond. The night air was cool and fresh, but there was no time to savor it. "Out. Now," Daniels urged, helping each of them climb out. The group emerged into the dense forest, the tall trees casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. Daniels glanced back, his instincts screaming that the circle wasn't far behind. He turned to Rachel. "We split up. They'll have a harder time tracking all of us." Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the kids. "I'll take Lila and Ethan. You and Henry draw them away." Daniels nodded. "Stay close to the river. It'll cover your tracks." Rachel grabbed the kids' hands, whispering, "Stay quiet and follow me." As they disappeared into the shadows, Daniels turned to Henry. "You ready?" Henry smirked, pulling a flare gun from his bag. "Always." Daniels and Henry bolted in the opposite direction, making as much noise as possible. Daniels knew the circle would follow the commotion, they were too disciplined not to. Branches snapped beneath their boots, and Henry fired the flare gun, sending a brilliant red light shooting into the sky. "Over here!" Henry shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The response was immediate. The sounds of footsteps and shouts came from behind them, closing in fast. Daniels ducked behind a thick tree, signaling for Henry to do the same. "Wait for it," Daniels whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures of the circle emerged, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Daniels held his breath, his grip tightening on his weapon. Daniels and Henry crouched low behind a massive tree trunk, their breaths slow and controlled. The circle's flashlights flickered through the forest like glowing eyes, accompanied by the crunch of boots on fallen leaves. "They went this way." One of the men barked. His voice sharp and commanding, Daniels held up 3 fingers, signaling Henry to stay calm. He mouthed the word "wait," his sharp eyes tracking the figures moving closer. Henry nodded, gripping the flare gun tightly. The circle spread out, their movements calculated and precise. One of the men stepped so close to Daniels' hiding spot that he could see the stitching on the man's boots. Henry's hand twitched, but Daniels shook his head ever so slightly. "Not yet." Suddenly, Daniels picked up a rock and hurled it into the bushes to their right. The sound of branches snapping made the circle spin toward the noise, their flashlights illuminating the empty underbrush. "There! Move!" a man yelled. His voice cutting through the night, the group charged toward the sound, their footsteps fading as they disappeared deeper into the woods. Daniels exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing. "That was too close," Henry whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Daniels gave him a small grin. "Close is better than caught. Let's move." They slipped through the shadows, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the circle. The flare gun had done its job. Rachel and the kids had a chance to escape. Meanwhile, Rachel led Lila and Ethan through the dense forest, her heart pounding with every step. The children were silent, their faces pale in the dim moonlight. "Are they coming after us?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. Rachel squeezed her hand gently. "No, sweetheart. Daniels and Henry are keeping them busy. We're going to be okay." Ethan stumbled over a root, falling to his knees. Rachel helped him up quickly, brushing dirt from his hands. "You're doing great, buddy. Just a little farther, I promise." In the distance, the sound of the river grew louder. Rachel knew it was their lifeline. If they could reach it, the water would mask their tracks and buy them precious time. The river came into view, its dark waters rushing over rocks and fallen branches. Rachel hesitated for a moment, scanning the area for any signs of danger. "The circle could be anywhere, we have to cross," she said, her voice firm but reassuring. "It's the only way to stay safe." Lila nodded, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. "We can do it." The water was freezing, biting at their legs as they waded in. The current was stronger than Rachel expected, pulling at them with relentless force. She held Lila's hand tightly, while Ethan clung to her other arm. "Almost there," Rachel said, her teeth chattering. "Just a few more steps." They reached the far bank, their clothes soaked and heavy, but relief washed over Rachel as she helped the kids onto solid ground. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself a small smile. They were one step closer to safety. As Rachel and the kids caught their breath, a distant sound made her freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, the hum of engines. The circle was still searching. Stay low, she whispered, pulling the kids down into the underbrush. The flashlights appeared on the opposite side of the river, their beams slicing through the darkness. Rachel's heart raced as she pressed herself against the ground, willing the shadows to keep them hidden. Lila clutched her arm tightly, her small body trembling. "They're coming," she mouthed silently. Rachel nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't stay here for long, but the circle was too close to risk moving. They had to wait, to trust that the darkness would keep them safe, for now. Rachel held her breath, every muscle in her body tense as the flashlights on the opposite bank flickered closer to the water's edge. The hum of engines grew louder, and she realized that the circle wasn't just walking, they were using ATVs to cover more ground. "They'll see our tracks in the water," Rachel thought, panic clawing at her chest. She gently squeezed Lila and Ethan's shoulders. "No noise, okay?" "Not even a whisper," she mouthed. One of the flashlights stopped directly across from where they were hiding. Rachel's stomach dropped as she heard a man's voice. "They crossed here," he said, his tone sharp. "Check downstream. If they're smart, they'll follow the current." The sound of engines revving sent a wave of relief through Rachel as the men began to move away. But she knew it was temporary, they wouldn't give up so easily. Rachel waited until the engines faded into the distance before daring to move. She sat up slowly, her ears straining for any sign of danger. "We need to keep moving," she whispered to the kids. But quietly. "Stay low." Ethan's face was pale, his lips trembling as he asked, "Will they find us, Mom?" Rachel knelt down and cupped his face, forcing herself to smile. "Not if we're careful. Remember, Daniels and Henry are keeping them busy. We just have to get far enough away." Lila nodded bravely, though Rachel could see the fear in her eyes. Together, they crawled through the thick underbrush, their soaked clothes clinging to them and the cold biting at their skin. The forest was eerily quiet now, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making Rachel's heart leap. She knew the circle wasn't far behind, but she also knew they had no choice but to press on. As they crept deeper into the forest, Rachel caught sight of something that filled her with a flicker of hope, a faint glow in the distance. It wasn't a flashlight, it was softer, steadier. "It's a cabin," she whispered, pointing toward the light. Ethan's eyes widened. "Do you think it's safe?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, "but we need shelter. Let's check it out." The three of them moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they approached the light. As they drew closer, Rachel could see that it wasn't a cabin but a small hunting lodge, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of a fire inside. Rachel stopped just short of the clearing, her instincts on high alert. She had to be sure it wasn't a trap. Rachel crouched low, scanning the area around the lodge for any signs of the circle. The place looked abandoned, but the fire suggested otherwise. "Stay here," she whispered to Lila and Ethan. "I'll check it out." Lila grabbed her arm, her voice trembling. "Mom, don't leave us." Rachel hesitated, her heart aching at the fear in her daughter's eyes. "Okay," she said softly. "But stay close to me. If anything happens, you run. Promise?" Both kids nodded solemnly, clutching her hands as they moved closer to the lodge. Rachel's pulse quickened as they reached the door. She knocked softly, then held her breath. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open just a crack, revealing the face of an elderly man with kind but weary eyes. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Rachel stepped forward, keeping her hands visible to show she wasn't a threat. "We're just passing through. My kids and we need a safe place for the night." The old man studied her for a moment before opening the door wider. "You look half frozen. Come in before you catch your death." Rachel hesitated but decided to trust her instincts. The man didn't seem to be part of the circle. She ushered Lila and Ethan inside, her eyes scanning the room quickly for anything suspicious. The lodge was small but cozy, with a crackling fire and shelves lined with canned goods. "Name's Walter," the man said, offering them a seat by the fire. "Looks like you've been through hell." Rachel nodded, her voice heavy with emotion. "You have no idea. Rachel guided the kids to the fire, their trembling bodies soaking in the warmth. The crackling flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an oddly comforting rhythm against the backdrop of their harrowing escape. Walter handed them a thick wool blanket. "Dry yourselves off. You're lucky you found this place, it's not on any map." Rachel hesitated as she took the blanket, her instinct still on high alert. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "We're just passing through." Walter sat in a creaky wooden chair, his weathered face studying them with quiet curiosity. "Passing through from what?" "Don't worry, I'm not one to pry, but you look like folks running from trouble." Lila looked up, her voice soft. "Bad men are chasing us." Rachel shot her a warning glance, but Walter didn't seem surprised. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Well, you found a moment's peace here. But if they're as bad as you say, you can't stay long." Rachel's gaze hardened. "Do you know these men? The Circle?" Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, and his jaw tightened. "I've heard of them," he said grimly. "People who don't belong to their beliefs tend to disappear. I keep this lodge off the grid for a reason." Rachel's heart sank. "They're after us because we helped someone escape. They won't stop." Walter leaned forward, his voice low. "Then you'd better be smarter than them. They know these woods like the back of their hand." Ethan clutched Rachel's arm. "Will they find us here?" Walter's expression softened as he looked at the boy. "Not tonight, they won't. They think they own the forest, but I've got my own tricks." Rachel's relief was short-lived. She knew Walter was doing his best to reassure them, but deep down, she also knew their safety was fragile. The Circle wasn't the kind of enemy to be deterred by a single night setback. As Rachel wrapped the blanket tighter around Ethan and Lila, Walter stood and walked to a cabinet near the fireplace. He pulled out an old map, worn and creased from years of use, and spread it out on the table. "You're headed east, right?" Walter asked. Rachel nodded. "There's a safe house waiting for us about 2 days from here." Walter traced a path with his finger. "This'll get you there, but it's not easy. The terrain's rough, and the Circle won't stop hunting. You'll need supplies." Rachel frowned. "We don't have much. Just what we could carry." Walter turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've got some gear you can take. But if you're caught, don't let them know you were here. This place stays secret, or more innocent lives will be at risk." Rachel nodded solemnly. "I promise." Later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep on a makeshift bed near the fire, Rachel sat at the table with Walter, her exhaustion barely held at bay. The old man poured 2 mugs of tea, sliding one toward her. "You look like someone who's used to fighting," Walter said quietly. Rachel stared into her mug. "I didn't have a choice. My kids, they're all that matter." Walter nodded, his gaze distant. "I lost my family a long time ago. That's why I'm out here, away from people, away from the pain." Rachel looked up, her heart aching at the sorrow in his voice. "I'm sorry." Walter shrugged. "It's the world we live in. People like the Circle think they can take what doesn't belong to them, control lives they have no right to. But you've got a chance to outrun them, maybe even stop them." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "How?" Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. "By being smarter, tougher, and more desperate than they are." When dawn broke, the forest was bathed in a golden light, the morning mist curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. Rachel woke the kids, who stirred reluctantly, their faces still heavy with sleep. Walter handed Rachel a small pack filled with supplies, dried food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a small hunting knife. "It's not much. But it's enough to keep you going." Rachel took the pack gratefully, her voice steady. "Thank you. For everything." Walter nodded, his expression firm. "The trail starts behind the lodge. Stay low and move fast. And Rachel," he added, his voice softening, "don't let them win." Rachel tightened her grip on the pack and ushered the kids toward the door. As they stepped into the crisp morning air, Rachel glanced back at Walter one last time. His figure stood framed in the doorway, a silent sentinel watching them vanish into the woods. Rachel guided the children into the dense forest, her heart pounding with determination. The morning mist clung to the ground, muffling their steps as they moved along the hidden trail Walter had pointed out. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent her nerves into overdrive, but she kept her focus sharp. "Mom, how far do we have to go?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. 2 days, Rachel said, glancing back at him. "We'll take breaks, but we have to stay ahead of them." Lila clutched Rachel's hand tightly. "What if they find us?" "They won't," Rachel said firmly, though the fear gnawed at her. "Walter gave us a good head start." She didn't tell them her real worry, that the circle would eventually figure out where they'd been. Walter had put his life at risk for them, and Rachel wasn't sure how much longer they could rely on borrowed luck. Back at the lodge, Walter sat by the fire, his rifle resting on his lap. He stared into the flames, his mind racing with the weight of his decision to help Rachel and her kids. He knew the circle wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Walter tensed, gripping the rifle tightly. "Who's there?" The door creaked open, and 3 men stepped in, their faces hard and cold. They wore dark clothing, their boots caked with mud. One of them spoke, his voice low and menacing. "We're looking for a woman and 2 kids. Came through here last night." Walter leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but steely. "Haven't seen anyone." The man's eyes narrowed. "Funny, because we found tracks leading to this place." "You sure you're not lying, old man?" Walter smirked. "You're welcome to look around, but you won't find anything." The men exchanged glances, then fanned out through the lodge, searching every corner. Walter kept his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding. He knew if they found even a trace of Rachel and the kids, it would mean the end for all of them. As the circle tore through the lodge, Walter stayed seated, his expression unreadable. He knew the cabin was clean, Rachel had been careful, and he had swept away any sign of their presence. Still, the tension was suffocating. One of the men returned, frustration etched on his face. "Nothing. Looks like he's telling the truth." The leader glared at Walter. "If we find out you're hiding them, there'll be hell to pay." Walter shrugged. "If they didn't come through here, they're probably long gone. Maybe you should be smarter about your search." The leader stepped closer, his face inches from Walter's. "Watch your mouth, old man. Next time, we won't ask." With that, they stormed out, slamming the door behind them. Walter exhaled slowly, his hands trembling. He knew they'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't bother knocking. Meanwhile, Rachel and the kids pressed on, their steps quick but careful. The forest grew denser, the sunlight barely piercing through the canopy above. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. And the sound of birdsong was their only company. Rachel paused to check the map Walter had given her. "We'll stop at the next clearing," she said. "We need to rest and eat." Ethan and Lila nodded, their small faces lined with exhaustion. Despite their fear, they trusted their mother completely. Rachel admired their resilience, even as her heart ached for what they'd been through. When they reached the clearing, Rachel spread out the supplies Walter had given them. "Eat up," she said softly. "We'll need our strength." As they ate, Rachel's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The safe house was still far, and the circle would be relentless. But she couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. She had to keep moving, for their sake. As the trio rested in the clearing, the woods seemed unnervingly quiet. The chirping of birds had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Rachel's instincts flared. She scanned the tree line, every shadow looking like a threat. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan and Lila stopped chewing, their wide eyes darting around. Suddenly, a faint crunching sound came from the forest. Rachel's heart jumped. She motioned for the kids to stay silent and crouched low, trying to pinpoint the source. Was it an animal? Or worse, one of the circle's men? The sound grew louder, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps. Rachel grabbed the hunting knife Walter had given her, holding it tightly. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she positioned herself between the sound and the kids, then the footsteps stopped, Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the shadows. The silence stretched, her nerves wound tight like a spring. Finally, a figure emerged, a lone hiker, a young woman with a large backpack and an expression of confusion. "Hello." The woman called out, her voice cautious. "Is someone there?" Rachel hesitated. She couldn't be sure this wasn't a trap, but the woman didn't look like one of the circle. Her clothes were worn but clean, and her face showed no malice. Still, Rachel kept the knife in her hand as she stepped forward. "Don't come any closer," Rachel said firmly, startling the woman. The hiker froze, raising her hands. "I'm just passing through. I didn't mean to scare you." Rachel studied her, looking for signs of deception. "Why are you here?" "I'm hiking the trail," the woman said, nodding toward the path behind her. "But you don't look like a hiker." Rachel weighed her options. If this woman was innocent, she could move along. But if she was tied to the circle, she couldn't risk letting her go. "Keep moving," Rachel said finally, her tone leaving no room for argument. The woman nodded and walked away, glancing back once before disappearing into the trees. Rachel didn't relax until she could no longer hear her footsteps. As night fell, Rachel and the kids set up a small, hidden camp. She used the flashlight sparingly, afraid to give away their location. Ethan and Lila huddled close to her, the fear of the unknown keeping them awake. "Mom," Ethan whispered, "do you think that lady will tell anyone she saw us?" Rachel stroked his hair, her voice calm despite her anxiety. "She didn't seem like a threat. But we have to be careful. Always." Lila hugged her knees. "I miss Walter. He made me feel safe." Rachel's throat tightened. She missed Walter too, the small sense of security he had given them. But she couldn't afford to dwell on it. The only way to survive was to keep moving. From somewhere deep in the forest, a faint howl echoed through the night. Rachel's hand instinctively went to the knife by her side. The kids clung to her, their small bodies trembling. "We'll be okay," Rachel whispered, more to herself than to them. "We have to be." Miles away, the circle's men regrouped after their fruitless search of Walter's lodge. Their leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, slammed his fist on the hood of a truck. "She's smart," he growled. "But not smart enough. She has kids with her, they'll slow her down." One of the men, thinner and wiry, nodded. "We found tracks leading east. She's headed toward the safe house." The leader smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Then we'll cut her off. She won't make it." As the men prepared to move out, the leader turned to one of his subordinates. "Burn the lodge. Let that old man know what happens to people who help traitors." The subordinate hesitated. What if he wasn't lying? The leader's glare silenced him. "Doesn't matter. Send a message." Rachel woke with a start, her instincts pulling her from a restless sleep. The faint smell of smoke reached her nose, carried by the night breeze. She sat up, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Mom." Lila whispered groggily. "What's wrong?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She climbed to her feet, moving toward an opening in the trees. In the far distance, a faint orange glow lit the sky. Her heart sank. The lodge. The circle had found it. Rachel returned to the camp, her resolve hardening. "We have to move. Now." Ethan and Lila scrambled to their feet, their fear pushing aside their exhaustion. Rachel packed their supplies quickly, her movements efficient and deliberate. As they slipped into the darkness of the forest, Rachel's mind raced. The circle was getting closer. And they were running out of places to hide, but she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Rachel and the children moved through the forest under the cover of darkness. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional crack of a branch underfoot or the rustling of leaves in the wind. Every sound felt amplified, making Rachel's nerves taut like a bowstring. "Mom, are they going to find us?" Lila asked softly, her voice quivering. Rachel crouched to meet her daughter's gaze. Not if we stay quiet and keep moving. You're brave, Lila, and I need you to trust me. Ethan tightened his grip on his sister's hand. I'll protect her, he said, his voice filled with determination beyond his years. Rachel smiled, though her heart ached at how quickly her children had been forced to grow up. She motioned for them to continue, leading them deeper into the woods where the trees grew denser, their canopy blotting out the faint light of the stars. By dawn, the trio reached a stream. Rachel allowed the kids to drink and wash their faces while she kept watch. The water was cold, a stark contrast to the tension that simmered in her chest. Mom, Ethan said, splashing his face, when will we get to the safe house? Rachel checked the map Walter had given her, tracing their progress with her finger. If we keep moving, we'll be there in another day or two. But we have to stay alert. She glanced up at the sky, where the first rays of sunlight were filtering through the treetops. It was a beautiful sight, yet it only served as a reminder of how exposed they were in the daylight. Let's go, Rachel said, helping Lila to her feet. We need to stay ahead of them. As they moved on, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She hoped it was just her imagination, but in her gut, she knew better. Back at the lodge, Walter stood in the smoldering ruins of what had once been his home. The circle had left nothing untouched. The walls were charred, the roof caved in, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of burned wood. He coughed, using a rag to cover his mouth as he sifted through the ashes. His heart ached, not just for the loss of his home but for the fear that Rachel and the kids might not make it. Walter knew the circle wouldn't stop. They would follow Rachel relentlessly, using every resource at their disposal. And if they caught her, he clenched his fists. He couldn't let that happen. Walter grabbed his rifle and a small pouch of supplies he had hidden in a safe spot outside the lodge. He would follow the trail he had sent Rachel on. If he couldn't stop the circle, he could at least buy her more time. Rachel's unease grew as the day stretched on. She kept her ears tuned to every sound, her eyes scanning the shadows that flickered between the trees. The children were quieter now. Sensing her tension, at one point, she stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal the kids to freeze. Ethan and Lila obeyed instantly, their eyes wide with fear. What is it? Ethan whispered. Rachel tilted her head, listening. A faint sound, a twig snapping, perhaps, reached her ears. It was too deliberate, too out of place in the natural symphony of the forest. We're not alone, she said under her breath. She ushered the kids behind a large tree and crouched down, gripping the hunting knife tightly. The seconds stretched into an eternity as they waited in silence. Then, through the trees, Rachel caught a glimpse of movement, a figure darting between the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest. Whoever it was, they were closing in. The figure moved closer, their steps deliberate but quiet. Rachel's breath hitched as she tried to make out their features. Then, suddenly, the figure stopped, crouching low as if searching for something on the ground. Tracks, Rachel realized with a sinking feeling. They're following our tracks. Run, she whispered to the kids, her voice barely audible. Now. Ethan and Lila didn't hesitate. They bolted through the trees, their small legs carrying them as fast as they could. Rachel followed close behind, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind them, the figure shouted, the sound echoing through the forest. Rachel didn't look back. She focused on keeping the kids ahead of her. Urging them to move faster, the forest became a blur of green and brown as they sprinted, dodging branches and leaping over roots. Rachel's lungs burned, but she refused to slow down. The circle was closing in, and their survival depended on staying ahead. Rachel and the children continued their journey through the dense forest, following the path marked on Walter's map. The morning sun peeked through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Rachel kept her eyes and ears open, every sense alert for any sign of danger. Look, Ethan pointed ahead. There's a path that splits off to the left. Rachel nodded, grateful for his keen eyes. They took the narrower trail, hoping it would lead them closer to the safe house and away from the circle's reach. As they walked, the ground beneath them became uneven, littered with roots and rocks. Lila stumbled, scraping her knee on a sharp root. Rachel quickly knelt to help her, her heart aching at her daughter's pain. are you okay, sweetie? Rachel asked gently, applying pressure to the scrape. Lila nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. It hurts, Mom. Rachel hugged her tightly. I know, but we have to keep moving. We're almost there. Ethan offered his hand to help his sister up, showing his protective side despite his young age. Meanwhile, Walter navigated his way through the forest, following the faint trail left by Rachel and the kids. He moved silently, his experience guiding him through the maze of trees and underbrush. He paused behind a large oak, watching as Rachel led Lila and Ethan along the path. Walter knew he had to stay hidden, but his heart ached knowing Rachel was in danger. Determined to help, he continued his pursuit, ready to assist whenever the time was right. As midday approached, Rachel and the children reached a small clearing. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above. They decided to take a short break, sitting down to eat some of the supplies Walter had given them. Rachel handed out the food, watching as her children ate hungrily. For a brief moment, there was a sense of peace amidst the chaos. We're doing great, Rachel said softly, feeling a surge of hope. Just a little bit more. After their meal, they continued along the path, the forest growing thicker and more mysterious. The trees towered above them, their branches intertwining to create a natural canopy that dimmed the sunlight. A sudden rustling in the bushes made Rachel freeze. She signaled for the children to stay still, her grip on the hunting knife tightening. Who's there? She called out cautiously. There was no answer, only the whispering wind moving through the leaves. Rachel exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. Let's keep moving, she whispered to the kids, urging them forward. As the day began to fade, Rachel spotted a distant structure through the trees, a small, weathered house nestled near a ridge. Her heart leapt with relief. We're almost there, she said, leading the children toward the safe house. The house looked abandoned, but Rachel knew it was their best chance for safety. As they approached, she noticed signs of recent activity, footprints in the dirt path and a faint light glowing from a window. We have to be careful, Rachel whispered. They might be waiting for us. She motioned for the children to stay close as they drew nearer, their breaths visible in the cool evening air. As they reached the safe house, the door swung open unexpectedly. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her kind eyes filled with concern. Come in, she said warmly. You must be tired and hungry. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. We need shelter for the night. The woman led them inside, offering blankets and warm drinks. Rachel felt a flicker of hope, grateful for the unexpected help. I'm Mrs. Thompson, the woman introduced herself. You're safe here. Inside the safe house, Mrs. Thompson listened as Rachel explained their situation. The children sat quietly, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. You're not alone anymore, Mrs. Thompson said gently. I've helped others before. We'll figure this out together. Rachel felt a weight lift off her shoulders. With Mrs. Thompson's help, they could come up with a new plan to stay safe and find a way to stop the circle once and for all. We need to find a way to expose them, Rachel said determinedly. So no one else has to go through what we did. As night deepened, Walter arrived at the safe house, cautious not to alert Mrs. Thompson. He watched from the shadows as Rachel and the children settled in. Ensuring they were safe, determined to help, he stepped forward quietly. Rachel, he whispered, relief evident in his voice. Rachel looked up, surprised but grateful. Walter. How did you find us? I couldn't let them take you, Walter replied firmly. We need to work together to stop the circle. Together with Mrs. Thompson, they began to plan their next moves, knowing that the circle was still out there, relentlessly pursuing them. With a solid plan in place, Rachel, Walter, and Mrs. Thompson set out to gather evidence against the circle. They worked tirelessly, collecting information and preparing to expose the group's sinister activities. The night was tense as they approached the heart of the circle's operations, a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. Flashlights flickered in the distance, signaling the circle's presence. We have to be careful, Rachel warned, her voice steady. This is our chance to end it. Inside the warehouse, they moved stealthily, avoiding the guards patrolling the area. Walter guided them to a locked office, where they found documents and recordings that proved the circle's crimes. Rachel carefully collected the evidence, her hands shaking with a mix of fear and determination. This was their chance to bring the circle down and protect others from their cruelty. "We need to get this to the authorities," she said, knowing the importance of their mission. As they prepared to leave with the evidence, alarms blared through the warehouse. The circle had discovered their presence. Men in dark suits emerged, weapons drawn, blocking their escape. "Stop right there," the leader of the circle demanded, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You've seen too much." Rachel stood her ground, clutching the evidence tightly. "It ends now. No one else should suffer because of you." A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with anticipation. Rachel knew they had to act quickly to protect themselves and ensure justice was served. In the midst of the confrontation, Walter stepped forward, his rifle aimed at the circle's leader. "Back off," he warned, his voice resolute. "We're not going to let you hurt anyone else." A fierce battle erupted. The sound of gunfire echoing through the warehouse. Amidst the chaos, Mrs. Thompson managed to send the evidence to the authorities, ensuring that the circle's crimes would be exposed. Walter fought bravely, but he was outnumbered. In a final act of courage, he held off the circle's men, giving Rachel and the children the chance to escape. With the authorities alerted and the evidence secured, the circle's operations began to crumble. Law enforcement arrived, arresting the members and dismantling the corrupt network that had terrorized the town. Rachel and the children watched as justice was served, their hearts heavy with the loss of Walter, who had sacrificed himself to protect them. Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she held Lila and Ethan close. "We did it," she whispered, though the victory was bittersweet. In the weeks that followed, the town began to heal from the shadows of the circle. Rachel was hailed as a hero for her bravery and determination to protect her children and bring justice to those who had wronged them. Lila and Ethan found solace in their new lives, surrounded by a community that cared for them. They never forgot the sacrifices made to keep them safe, especially the memory of Walter's bravery. Rachel felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that together, they could overcome any challenge. One evening, Sheriff Daniels visited Rachel and the children. Tears in his eyes as he shared his gratitude. "I never stopped caring about what happened here," he said softly. "Your bravery saved us all." Rachel smiled through her tears, embracing the sheriff. "We couldn't have done it without everyone's help. It's a new day for our town." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the horizon, Rachel looked out the window with Lila and Ethan by her side. The dark nights were behind them, replaced by the promise of brighter days filled with love, safety, and the unbreakable bond of family. "Thank you for believing in us," she whispered, feeling the weight of their journey lift. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Rachel knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with courage and hope lighting their way. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and know that no matter who you are or where you come from, every decision you make has the power to shape not just your life, but the lives of those around you. We all face moments when fear tempts us to stay silent or turn away. The story of Rachel reminds us that courage isn't about having no fear, it's about taking action despite it. Rachel's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about love, sacrifice, and fighting for what truly matters. Walter's ultimate act of bravery taught us that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in putting others above ourselves. These emotions, love, fear, hope, are ones we all know. They're the threads that connect us. Every time you choose kindness, courage, or hope, you plant a seed for something better. Every time you take a stand, you light a path for others. Think about a time when you were afraid to act. How might things have changed if you had chosen differently? What choice can you make today that will leave the world a little brighter? In the end, it's not the battles we fight, but the bravery we show, that defines us. Be the light in someone else's darkness, and let that light guide you, too.